It was over 10 years after Kubrick's phenomenal science fiction masterpiece that 2010 was released in the cinemas, based on Arthur C. Clarke's very own sequel novel, published 2 years earlier in 1982. The novel, however, was the sequel to Kubrick's film as opposed to his own novel, and whether this was to get it out to a greater audience is not clear, but it certainly had no effect in coaxing back the legendary director to sit behind the camera. Instead, Peter Hyams, director of the slightly above average conspiracy sci-fi thriller Capricorn 1, takes to the director's chair, makes here another slightly above average sci-fi thriller. Whilst not the majesty and enigma of the original, Hyams skillfully handles this much anticipated sequel. He also wrote the screenplay, and although some additions he made to Clarke's story are decidedly ill-fitting and unnecessary, what you're left with is a relatively good film. Kubrick can be seen, along with the author Arthur C. Clarke, in brief cameos as the Russian and American leaders pictured on the front of Time magazine. The story this time follows Haywood Floyd, who, when we met him in the original, was played by William Sylvester. Here he is none other than Roy Chief Brody Scheider, and since the disaster of Discovery 1, he was held responsible and quit as a result. He's coaxed back to accompany a joint American-Russian team of astronauts aboard the Leonov, and they journey back to Jupiter to investigate the disappearance of Dave Bowman, and more importantly the strange monolith still floating in orbit around the planet. This premise is generally the same as Clarke's novel, although here for the big screen the general mood between the Yanks and the Ruskies is not too hot, as we hear of a war brewing between the two countries at home on Earth, and the storyline is made into a prominent feature that the books seem to work fine without. If anything, it's an inclusion typical of the 80s. See Rocky IV, see Red Heat. It's a storyline that I find helps to date the movie quicker than perhaps it should have, and really does nothing for the tension of the film. A perfect example of how awful this extra storyline is would be summed up nicely by the film's ending. Without giving too much away, the book ends with the crew of the Leonov receiving a message from the monolith, in which Earth is warned away from Europa. In the movie's end, the same message is received by the Leonov, but the all-knowing extraterrestrials had to add a melodramatic sentimental footnote about working together and in peace. This hideous happy ending that ruins the mystery of the book. To me, Hyams was trying to emanate the feel-good message that Spielberg had captured with Close Encounters, yet I think Hyams failed. It felt to me like it was merely tagged onto the film to appeal to a wider audience. The movie has a brilliant cast and some excellent effects, and I imagine that due to there being a larger cast in the film, that there's more going on in this movie to entertain most audiences than there was in Kubrick's slow-paced and mostly silent movie. Scheider is decent as Haywood, but hardly notable. His character seemed a lot more the leader than in the novel, where he is merely taking a back seat to all the scientists. Through the film we hear voiceover of the letters that he writes back to his wife on Earth. They have a corny, dreamy echo and seem to be read from the page, whereas the same letters in the novel were a lot more spontaneous. In fact, the relationship between Floyd and his wife frayed with time and distance in the novel. The movie opts for a more rose-tinted ending. Among the cast playing the crew of the Leonov are actors such as Close Encounters actor Bob Balaban as Dr. Chandra, the strange creator of HAL, hired to re-establish a link to that psychopathic artificial intelligence. There are also relatively early appearances from John Lithgow and Helen Mirren. Lithgow's character in the book is typical of a character Lithgow would play, wisecracking and humorous, but it was almost watered down in the film, which seems a shame not to have utilised that ability in the actor. Helen Mirren, being British, obviously is hired to play a Russian. Here the ship's captain and a stern cold pitch too, portrayed cold and hostile as Russians so very often are. Special effects were created by Douglas Trumbull's Entertainment Effects Group, although Trumbull, who played a large part in the effects of the first movie, didn't personally work on the sequel. They were a great addition to the movie and helped create some terrific tension in certain key moments. The scene where the two astronauts first board Discovery, approaching as it spins freely in the planet's orbit, is one that stands out to me. Early CGI was used too, most notably in the swarm of monoliths that begin to spread throughout Jupiter's atmosphere. The bizarre Stargate Hotel scene at the close of 2001 is crudely replicated here in this sequel, when Floyd is visited by the apparition of Dave Bowman. And although the same actor reprises his role, it only really acts as a concept linked to the original, and doesn't evoke the same unanswered questions. Here you accept it's happening, and if when you watch the original you were liable to emit a solitary laugh at the absurdity and dated effects, here the scene is just laugh out loud ridiculous. It was never going to be the painstaking art that Kubrick and Clarke's incredible vision had proven to be, but it does make for a good watch. The original will always stand out as a benchmark, and 2010 was a relatively good sequel that perhaps wasn't really necessary, but it didn't hurt either. It wasn't as mystical or claustrophobic. In fact, it felt more like a space adventure than a space documentary, but it was a solid attempt of a sequel. That's all I've got time for. Thanks ever so much for listening. Feel free to drop a comment below, give us a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thanks very much. Good night.